Hi everybody, Andrew here, back for another Barista Basics video. Before I get into today's video, I need to make a quick disclaimer that any opinions stated in my videos are my own. I am not here to represent Starbucks or any other corporation or impede on any of these companies' intellectual property or trademarks. These videos are just simply meant for fun and educational purposes. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into today's topic, which is the processing of coffee cherries. So last week we discussed the anatomy of a coffee cherry, so I figured the next few videos would follow the journey of our coffee cherry from harvest to roasting, which result in the roasted coffee beans, of course, that we know and love. So after we have harvested our coffee cherries, we then process them. So I have here another cheat sheet, of course, of the 3 most common methods of processing coffee cherries. The most common method, which I have listed first, is the wet processed method. This is also referred to as the washed method. We then have the dry processed method, also referred to as the natural method, and we have the wet hold method. This one has a bunch of different names, but the most colloquial is the honeying method. So to get into our first process, the wet processing method, this is, like I said, the most common method of processing coffee because it allows for the most control throughout the process, which in turn results in more consistency in our final product. And that makes sense because we can see that this process has the most steps out of any of these other processes. So to get into these steps, we first sort our harvested coffee cherries, and we do this by conducting the floating method. And so this is where we place the coffee cherries in water, and we see which ones sink and which ones float. The ones that sink are our ripe coffee cherries, and the ones that we want to use for the rest of the process, and the ones that float are undesirable, and we discard those. So after we have selected the coffee cherries that we want, we then depulp them. And this is where we remove the 2 outermost layers of the coffee cherry, which we learned last week are the exocarp and the mesocarp. So after this, we then ferment our coffee cherries to remove the mucilage. So we do this by placing the coffee cherries in big vats of water, and they sit in there for a day or two while they ferment. And so fermentation, as I'm sure some of us are aware, is the process by which microorganisms like bacteria or yeast break down sugars and in turn make alcohol. So this connects to what I mentioned last week regarding the mucilage, which is the high amount of pectin in it. And like I said last week, pectin is a polysaccharide, aka a sugar, so this fermentation process is the really great way to remove the mucilage since literally it just loves to dissolve sugar. So we have fermented our coffee cherries for a day or two to remove the mucilage. And so after we have done this, we sort our coffee cherries again using the floater method. We collect the ones that sink, and then we go ahead and dry them. So the amount of time it takes for these to dry is variable because what we're really looking for is a moisture content level of 10 to 12%. So once we have reached that range, we can then hull our coffee cherries, which is where we remove the final 2 layers, the parchment and the silver skin, and that leaves us with our coffee beans. Now the wet processing method results in coffee that is more acidic and has a cleaner finish to it. Now moving on to our dry process method, this is the oldest method of processing coffee, which makes sense because it is also the most rudimentary and the most basic because it doesn't utilize any water. And so this process is really useful for places that either have unreliable access to water or for places with climates that are pretty arid and dry, places that don't experience a lot of rainfall. So similarly, we first sort our coffee cherries. However, instead of using the floater method to sort them, we use a process called winnowing. And so winnowing is where we place some coffee cherries in a basket and we literally toss them into the air. Now the wind will blow away the lighter coffee cherries, the undesirable ones, the ones we don't want, And the ones that fall back into our basket are the ripe coffee cherries. And so, of course, these are the ones we want to use for the rest of the process. So after we have winnowed our coffee cherries, we then dry them. We haven't depulped them, so it still has the exocarp and the mesocarp on it. We are just drying the entire coffee cherry fruit as it is. So this typically takes 2 to 6 weeks. The average is about 4. And again, we're looking for that 10 to 12% moisture content level. Sorry, my birds are going a little crazy. I'll just wait for them to subside. Awesome. Sorry about that again. So we are looking for that 10 to 12% moisture content level, and it's really important in drying coffee cherries with this method to continuously rotate and rake our coffee cherries so that we don't grow any mildew or any unwanted bacteria. So after we have reached that ideal moisture content level range, we can then depulp and hull our coffee cherries, leaving us with just our coffee beans. And so the dry processing method results in coffee that has a more intense flavor, a more fruity flavor. This fruity flavor has been described as berry-like. And so that leaves us with our final most common processing method, the wet hold method. Like I said, this is most commonly referred to as the honeying method. We're gonna collect my breath here while we wait for them to chill out. Fabulous. So the honeying method is essentially a hybrid of the wet processing method and the dry processing method. So as we can see here, we do depulp our coffee cherries like we do for the wet processing method, but we don't ferment them. So when they dry, they still have the mucilage intact. And this is where these colors that I have listed under this process come into play. The white honeyed coffee has the least amount of mucilage, whereas our black honeyed coffee has the most. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, so let's go ahead and start at the beginning of this process, which is, of course, sorting our coffee cherries. Now, I couldn't find anything specifically that mentions whether or not they use the floating method or the winnowing method, but I assume since water is allowed in this process, they probably use the floater method. So we sort our coffee cherries, we collect the ones that sink, and then we depulp them. So we remove the exocarp and the mesocarp, but we do not remove the mucilage, like I said. So we dry our coffee cherries with the mucilage intact. Now the amount of mucilage will affect how our resulting coffee will taste. For the white and yellow honeyed coffees that have the least amount of mucilage, they are typically, well, they are commonly comparable to the wet processed coffee in the sense that it has a cleaner finish to it. Moving on to our gold, red, and black honeyed coffees. These, again, like I said, have varying amounts of mucilage, but another key difference for these guys is the amount of sunlight that they are exposed to, which in turn affects the amount of time it takes to dry, which also affects the amount of humidity that these coffee cherries are exposed to. So for our gold honeyed coffee, this is the coffee cherry that dries the quickest because it is allowed to dry in direct sunlight. It's allowed to dry in direct sunlight, so it dries the quickest. Now, moving on to our red honeyed coffee, this is exposed to less sun, more shade, which means that it takes longer to dry, which means that it is exposed to more humidity, of course, since it's taking longer to dry. And so this results in coffee that is more acidic than the other three colors that I just previously mentioned, but it still is able to maintain its sweetness. And that leaves us with our black honeyed coffee. And like I said, this is the one with the most amount of mucilage left on it, almost 100% of the mucilage is left intact for black honeyed coffee. And so along with that, this also is exposed to the least amount of sun and the most amount of shade. And so this of course means it takes longer for our coffee cherries to dry, which in turn also means we are exposed to the most amount of humidity. And so black honeyed coffee is comparable to that of our dry processed coffee in the sense that it has a pretty intense, complex, and nuanced flavor to it. And so to review, we have the three most common processing methods: the wet process method, the dry process method, and the wet hold method. So with that said, that is all for today's video. I hope that you guys enjoyed that video. I hope that you guys learned something. Sorry for my birds going a little bit crazy. I had to pause a few moments there to allow Jupiter, one of my birds, to get her chirps out. So again, I'd like to apologize for that, but I hope that you guys learned something. I hope that you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope that you guys have a great day. Thank you so much.